So first and foremost, I got to apologize. I have failed to produce a vlog every single day, and there's a good reason for that. It's not like I haven't been doing anything. I haven't been lazy. I've been totally productive. I fill every waking second of my day with productive activity. It's just that I work at a hospital, and sometimes I work 12-hour shifts, and it's just impossible to fit everything into the day. Editing one of these vlogs takes me 2 hours sometimes. So, I gotta forgive myself and allow myself time. But I think the vlog is gonna have to be primarily an off-day thing for me. And thankfully, because I work 12-hour shifts, I get a lot of off days. So the vlog will still be a regular thing. Just expect it like 4 days a week instead of 7 days a week. But I'll do it as often as I can. I'm just taking on so many things at once. But that's beside the point. We're here today to continue talking about, to go back over things that I discussed in the last vlog and discuss new things about Charles Galton Darwin's The Next Million Years. Now, the problem is with the last episode, and the reason that I'm going to go over everything again, is that I thought here on the copyright page, I had a misunderstanding about who the author was. I thought it was the Charles Darwin of theory of natural selection fame. But that is not the case. You see up here on the copyright page, there's a Library of Congress cataloging and publication data. And it says Darwin, Sir Charles Galton, 1887, if you can see that. So I took that to mean the book was published in 1887 by the Charles Darwin of theory of natural selection fame. After doing a little research, I discovered that the Charles Darwin of theory of natural selection fame died in 1882. Now, I didn't know that, so I assumed that it was the Charles Darwin and that he wrote this book, which makes a lot of the predictions that are made in this book a lot more impressive. If he was talking about some of these things in 1887, that would be mind-blowing. And it was mind-blowing when I thought that was the case. But it turns out that that is the birthday of the Charles Darwin's grandson, English physicist Sir Charles Galton. Sir Charles Galton Darwin. And it was actually written in 1952 and published in 1953. So that makes a lot of sense. That brings a lot of things to light. So we're going to go back over the things that I talked about just briefly and with a few extra thoughts that I forgot to mention last time. The things that I talked about last time. We're going to go back over those, and then I'm halfway through the book now, and I've taken extensive notes, and I've highlighted some sections that I'd love to read to you that you might find interesting. So I'm going to do that, and we're going to make a good time of it. Alright, so The Next Million Years. This is the book in which Sir Charles Galton Darwin, grandson of the Charles Darwin of theory of natural selection fame. I'll stop saying that, it's a bit much. This is the book in which he attempts to predict the average history of the human race going forward for the next million years. And that's a very daunting task. That's a very big claim to make, that you're able to predict the average history of the human race for the next million years. But he says that he can do this, or he believes that he can do this, by looking back over the past history of mankind and watching the trends and taking lessons from the animal kingdom and our knowledge of the theory of natural selection and other things and the advancement of technology, and creating not an accurate telling of historical events that will take place in the next million years, but telling of the average history of what the human race will be. And he says that the main character of history has always been the population. Who is alive, who's dead, but mostly who's alive and what they do with the world. So he thinks that he can predict what the next million years will be like by just working out who will probably be around and the character of the people who will probably be around. So he points out the first thing that he would like to discuss is that one of the few natural selection factors that we still share with the animal kingdom as humans is the availability of food. It's the only thing that limits our population anymore. We've more or less conquered disease, he points out, but, well, he points out that we're in the process of conquering disease. I don't think we're nearly as there as he assumes, because germs and bacteria, they abide by the same laws of natural selection that we do. So when we use antibiotics, we're just breeding stronger germs, antibiotic-resistant diseases. But he doesn't seem to think about that or worry about it. But so he points out that food is the last thing that's really limiting human growth. And Malthus, he references Malthus, who and maybe you've heard of Malthus before. Maybe you've heard the term Malthusian collapse. That's the idea that the population gets too high and food scarcity goes way up. There's not enough food, and so people start to starve and the population drops down dramatically. Most people die in a Malthusian collapse. Now, he references Malthus and talks about how Malthus tried to devise solutions to the food problem in his essay on population, but that it's still a problem because there wasn't much excitement around Malthus's ideas, because they probably wouldn't have worked. Basically, Malthus failed to devise a realistic solution to the food problem. And Darwin theorizes that with the agricultural methods of the day, 1953, the world could support probably a 15 billion person cap, I think. So this is one of the problems. I wrote in my notes that Darwin said that the world could support a 10-fold increase in population. And I assumed that that was from a population of 1.5 billion in 1887 when I thought this book was published, but it was published in 1953. And I think there was something like 3 billion people, maybe 4 billion people on the planet in 1953. 4 to 5 billion sounds about right to me for 1953. But, okay, so yeah, he was saying that he thought the world could support about 15 billion people, and that he believed that it was his personal belief that the food production of the world could sustainably be increased to double or triple its size in 1953. And that meant doubling or tripling the carrying capacity of the world from his day's population to about 15 billion. And he thought that it was possible that methods could be devised scientifically to increase the amount of food production by 10-fold, and he acknowledges that it could very well be possible that food production could be increased 100-fold or 1,000-fold, but he doesn't think it's possible. He personally believes that maybe we'll be able to achieve a 10-fold increase. Possibly there's an off chance that we'll be able to increase our food production by 10-fold. That's his personal belief. He goes back and he references Malthus again, and Malthus's theory that every species has a natural rate of increase when in the ideal conditions for reproduction and the survival of offspring. And Darwin assumes that the human rate is to double every century. I personally disagree with him on that. I think the numbers show that it's to quadruple. He points out that some parts of the world have quadrupled their population since the Industrial Revolution, or in the last century. He says some parts of the world have quadrupled their population, but he personally believes that these are extreme cases, and that the average rate of increase for the human race as a whole is to double every century. But I don't think the numbers show that out. I think it's very clearly quadrupling every century. So that becomes a big problem, because he predicts that the world will reach carrying capacity from his time 200 years after 1953. That's when he predicts that the world will reach carrying capacity, and we won't be able to produce enough food to feed everybody anymore, and there will probably be a Malthusian collapse. But if we're quadrupling every century, we're going to reach 15 billion a lot sooner than that. Thankfully, the rate of population increase seems to be slowing down a little bit, but I think we're going to reach carrying capacity before we stop growing. He then rightfully points out that the Industrial Revolution is to blame for the rapid increase in population. He asks, how is it that at the start of the 19th century, right when we needed factory workers, the children were there to supply the factory work? And that's a scary question. He doesn't agree with child labor in factories. He says that it was a horrifying sight to see children working in factories. But he asked the question of, how is it that when we needed the factory work, the children were just magically there to provide it? And the answer is that the factories made it possible for those children to come into existence in the first place. It rose everybody's standard of living. And that, combined with new advances in medicine, brought the survival rate of children to almost 100%. It had always been assumed throughout history that the survival rate for children was very low, that only the lucky few would survive childbirth and childhood and make it to adulthood. And that was just the way it was. And then the Industrial Revolution came along, and advances of medicine made in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the number of children dying dropped so dramatically. And it was a result of the Industrial Revolution and the factories and the hospitals. So it's not surprising that these children went to work in the very factories that produced them. It's kind of like you could call it industrial Darwinism. It's kind of spooky. It's like industrial capitalism producing quantity for the sake of quantity, even in the human population, with no regard for quality of life or the well-being of people. And that's a good critique of industrial capitalism. But he points out that in the future, who inherits the world is going to come down to who has the food. It's not necessarily going to be who's having the most children. It won't necessarily be China. It won't necessarily be India. It won't necessarily be Nigeria. These places with huge populations that are growing and growing and growing, Pakistan, other places. It's not going to be these places that necessarily inherit the earth just because they're having the most children. It's going to be who wins the food wars. It's going to be who's best at conquering food. And it's going to be about strategy, tactics, and the numbers of genius generals per population, and the bravest soldiers. And he points out that there's historical precedent for very small populations. He says very small races of people going out and just dominating the world despite being in relatively small numbers, like the Athenians or the Spartans, or in his time in 1953, and arguably continuing to this day. Arguably continuing to this day, the European races are out there dominating the world, and we're a very small minority. And that's pretty much how he finishes up the chapter on population. But the four revolutions is where he starts to become a little more prophetic. And he talks about the four revolutions of mankind, and he defines revolutions as something that we learn how to do something technological, basically, that we never go back from. Maybe it only starts with one population, but it spreads around the world, and we never go backwards from the revolution. Because if we were to go backwards from the revolution, so many people would die, and we would quickly realize the error of our ways, and we would readopt the revolution. And the four revolutions that he lists are fire, for dramatically increasing the nutrition of our food; agriculture, for dramatically increasing the amount of food that we can produce; urbanization, for bringing people together, allowing people to specialize in things other than food production, and creating places to store food for when there were food shortages. And the fourth one, he says, is the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution, of course, led to the Industrial Revolution, which, of course, led to the dramatic increase in population that we see today. So these are the revolutions, and they don't necessarily happen everywhere all at once, like I said, but they are an extreme advantage for the people to which they happen first. And Darwin theorizes that the next revolution could have to do with food production. He theorizes that maybe we could find a way to synthesize food from its chemical elements, or something of the sort. New agricultural methods that would dramatically increase the rate at which food is produced. Genetic modification. He theorizes that another possible future revolution could be in the arts. He doesn't have very much to say on that. He says that another revolution could be in predicting the future, which I found very interesting. At his time, it was probably pretty out there to say something like this, but basic computers were around, so it wouldn't have been difficult to extrapolate the progress being made on the complication and advancement of computers into the future to see what they could do possibly in the future. He believed that by means of machines that could do calculations at incredible speeds and much faster than the human mind, machines could be used to predict the outcome of public policy or predict the outcome of wars. And I'm a little iffy on the war thing. I think that predicting the outcome of public policy is something that's pretty achievable, especially economic policy, to a degree. But the outcome of wars, my thought process is, if a machine tells a nation, hey, if you declare war on this guy, you'll win, and then that country goes into war knowing that they're going to win, I feel like that makes them a lot more sloppy. I feel like knowledge of the events of the future is going to change those events. So, this isn't predestination. So I'm a little bit iffy on the effectiveness of a machine built to predict the outcomes of wars. And then he says that another possible revolution could be in the altering of human nature, genetic modifications of human beings. And he says that he's unsure that this revolution is possible. It's theoretically possible, but he doesn't know if the human race could pull it off successfully, partly because it's so dangerous. There are effectively an infinite number of traits that your DNA gives you. And this is because not only do genes program for a certain trait, but combinations of genes program for different traits. One gene could be present and another gene could be present, and that means you experience the same trait, but if gene 2 isn't present and a different gene is in its place, then it's a completely different trait. So it's not one trait per gene, it could be many, many traits per gene. They serve different roles. So it's impossible to know how you're going to change somebody by changing one gene in their genome. So he thinks it's dangerous and very difficult to do. And even if we devised a way to do it that would be beneficial to the person that we're doing it to, and we were able to create some kind of Superman or a race of supermen, that the human race would very quickly, out of jealousy or fear that this super race would dominate everybody, destroy the race of supermen. And I'd say that it's theoretically possible to create so-called supermen and have them mingle with the population. It would have to be top secret. Maybe the CIA could pull it off or something. But genetic modification of humans, turn them into supermen, strategically place them throughout your population to secretly uplift everybody. I think that's something that's feasible. It's not democratic. I don't think the people would put up with it. Congress wouldn't put up with it because they have people to please, not necessarily because politicians are good people, but because they have to please their constituents to an extent. But the CIA could pull it off. Some future technocratic regime could pull it off. The Chinese government could pull it off for sure. And I think the Chinese government actually is trying to pull something like that off, genetically modified super soldiers. I think they're doing research into it. I know there was that Chinese scientist who successfully increased the IQ of some child in the uterus, and I think he was imprisoned for a time in China for doing this, but I think they are paying him to continue his research in a more humane and government supervised manner. So China is working on this, we know that, and that might motivate a future US regime to give the CIA the go-ahead to do the same. Or some secret military project, Manhattan Project level secret, right? And then he goes on to talk about material conditions, and his main focus for this chapter seems to be on energy production. He rightfully points out that we're quickly running out of things like coal and oil, and it's not going to last forever. But before he gets into that, he pictures the human race evolving into a completely different species someday, in 1 million years or something. And he says that that's about how long it takes to change human nature. And I'm not sure what he means by this, because you can make very significant psychological changes in a population over a very short period of time, genetically, not just by indoctrination or education. You can genetically change them very quickly. It is widely believed and theorized in the field of evolutionary psychology that the average IQ of Europe as a whole, from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance, rose probably 15 to 20 IQ points, because the rate of execution of young men was so high, because there was a large criminal population, a large low IQ criminal population in Europe around the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And the various nations that Europe split up into started executing this criminal population in mass. They would commit a crime, and there were very high consequences for committing even simple crimes. And it was estimated, I think, that at some points, and I may have this number wrong, but there were points in the Dark Ages, in the Middle Ages, at which several percentage points, I don't want to say a specific percentage point, but several full percentage points of the population were being executed every generation. And this led to a gradual increase in the overall intelligence of the European race, and then they were able to go out and do a renaissance. So you can make very significant changes, the difference between barbarism and civilization building, in a very short period of time with the right selection pressures. So I'm not entirely sure what he means by changing human nature. I suppose he could mean the vanilla definition of transforming into a new species, as he says, which is that we will not be able, that somebody from today will not be able to breed with a human being from 1,000,000 years from now if they were to come back in time. And that makes sense to me, but you can change a lot about human nature in a very short period of time. I do believe that. In a historically short period of time. When compared to 1,000,000 years, it's a blink of an eye. And then he goes a little bit into dysgenics. He uses the example of spectacles or glasses, and he says that they removed the check on short-sightedness. So in the past, if you were short-sighted, this dramatically decreased your chances of survival. If you were a kid that couldn't see running around because you were short-sighted, you were much more likely to get yourself hurt or killed because you're not as capable of sensing danger. So that was a check on short-sightedness. Every generation, a certain amount of the short-sighted people would just die. And it was a much larger amount than the people who weren't short-sighted. So short-sightedness was checked by a selection pressure. But now that we have glasses and spectacles, he points out that short-sightedness has become more common in the population. And it will become more common as time goes on because that check is no longer there. Short-sighted people are having children. And you can imagine this for various other things. Sickly people who have seasonal allergies. Back in the day before modern medicine, seasonal allergies could have developed into something much, much worse. Pneumonia, perhaps, and you would have died early. But these days, it's nothing to worry about. And almost everybody has seasonal allergies. Can you imagine if we lost modern medicine overnight? How many people, how dramatically the average lifespan would drop because we've become so dysgenic. We all have so many of these unhealthy genes in our bodies because the Industrial Revolution and the medicine revolution made it possible for people who otherwise would have died to continue on to reproduction. And this isn't a moral question. I'm not, and Darwin points out as well, this is not about whether it's good or bad that I'm alive today, or that you're alive today, or that anybody is alive today, or whether it's good or bad that people used to die in the past. These are just cold, hard facts. If we lost industrial civilization and industrial medicine tomorrow, most people would die. Most people would die. We no longer have what it takes to survive in nature. And it's not because we don't have the knowledge to do it, it's because we are not genetically fit for it. We have become adapted to our comfortable environments on a genetic level. And that's kind of sad. It's kind of existentially distressing to think that the human race is spiraling downwards toward who knows what end of indignity and sickliness. And I say this is not something that necessarily has to happen. With the recognition that it is a morally good thing to do to prevent vast amounts of future suffering and indignity, and with the political will to do it, this could be reversed. We could improve ourselves as a species. So we simply need the will to do it. And he goes into the non-inheritability of learned traits. For people who aren't familiar with heritability of genetic traits, you do not obviously pass on learned knowledge that you've learned throughout your life. You're not going to pop out a baby and it's not going to know about Charles Darwin's The Next Million Years because you watched a vlog about it a couple years ago, you know. So that's important to know. And actually, I'll point out that we know a little bit about epigenetics. You can change your genes by doing certain things throughout your life. Or you can't change your genes. You always have these genes with you, and you will pass them on to your children. But you can change the ways, you can change whether or not certain genes are expressing themselves. So it's a possibility that you could reproduce, and, you know, let's say I reproduce 3 years ago and I'm fat and lazy and stupid, and I pop out a baby and it has the fat, lazy, stupid genes. But I work really hard for 5 years to improve myself. I go to the gym, I eat right, I do hard things, and, you know, I educate myself. And I completely change the way in which I live my life, and I change the genes that are expressing themselves, and I pass those on to a kid, and I pop out a child. Well, not me, I won't be popping out the child, but I reproduce, and my child is not fat, lazy, stupid. He's motivated to go out and do hard things and become educated, and he's smart. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know very much about epigenetics. It's something that I'm interested in. There are limits to epigenetics. I want to make that clear. Genetics is not totally undeterministic. It's not all about human will, although I have a lot of good things to say about human will, but I am a very loose genetic determinist, but you can improve yourself and the genetic conditions of your offspring to an extent with epigenetics. I know that, but there's a limit to it. There is a limit to it, because those possible genetic changes for your body to make were always with you. You pass those on. You don't increase the ceiling with each generation without selection pressures or freak mutations, but freak mutations are usually negative, usually decrease your chances of survival. But anyways, I'm going off on a big tangent right now. Now, he goes on to talk about, and I didn't take very many notes on this because I don't care a whole lot, and I think he's very wrong. He talks about how coal seems to be the best method of energy production, and he doesn't have very much hope for the future of atomic energy. And he also thinks that solar energy and wind energy are too complicated and inefficient for us to, well, he thinks wind energy is too inefficient and complicated for us to produce a significant amount of power from. He thinks that solar energy is our best bet. He was dead wrong there. It's terrible. Solar energy is terrible, and the production of solar panels pollutes the environment so much, and it takes so much more energy to build a solar panel than the solar panel will actually produce in its lifetime. So he's just wrong. Atomic energy is the future. The only thing that he's correct about in this section is hydroelectric energy, which he points out is very efficient, and it's great, but it just isn't enough. We don't have enough rivers that we can dam to create the energy needs that we're going to need in the future. So he's very pessimistic about atomic energy, and I think he's wrong to be pessimistic about atomic energy. I think atomic energy is the future. So didn't take much notes on that because I really don't care, and I think he's wrong. And then he goes on to discuss the types of humans that exist. Now that's the end of material conditions. So he goes on in chapter 5, which is the species Homo sapiens, that's the title of the chapter, to discuss the various characters that make up the human race, the various archetypes, the types of people that are out there, and whether or not he foresees these types of people increasing in numbers, becoming a larger portion of the human race, and defining the character of the human race as a whole going forward into the future. And he talks about some very interesting things. I actually have some cool highlights that I want to discuss. One of the first ones that he talks about is the parasite, the archetype of the parasite. And I would like to read a little bit of what he has to say here. He says, all through the animal kingdom, one of the most successful roles is that of the parasite. And there are states of human society where such a parasite as the professional beggar is as successful as anyone else. Something of the kind is unfortunately true in Britain just now. The people we are really encouraging are not those that we think we are. For a great many of the people who get good promotion are contributing less than their share to the next generation. At present, the most efficient way for a man to survive in Britain is to be almost half-witted, completely irresponsible, and spending a lot of time in prison, where his health is far better looked after than outside. On coming out with restored health, he is ready to beget many further children quite promiscuously, and these problem children are then beautifully cared for by the various charitable societies and agencies until such time as they have grown old enough to carry on the good work for themselves. I couldn't agree more with that. But he's not too worried about parasites as a possibility of becoming, the future makeup of the human race, because parasites naturally kill the host, and then when the host dies, the parasite dies. So basically, parasitical humans pose a danger to the societies in which they live, but there is no danger for the survival of the human race as a whole, because when the host becomes exhausted, the parasite dies. So he's not too worried about parasites going into the future. Then he talks about Bronze Age savages. And as someone who loves Bronze Age mindset, I had a blast reading that. I really enjoyed this section. He talks about, so the archetype that he names it, he doesn't use the term Bronze Age savage, but he calls them the heroes. Not the hero, what we would call a hero today, but like the Homeric hero, who has his counterparts in many other semi-barbaric conditions of life. He's brave and reckless, but selfish, undisciplined, and something of a bully. He is by taste a leader, but his leadership is often marred by impatience and lack of persistence, so that he fails to carry through to the end any projects which would take a long time. He cares little for the sufferings of others, unless they are his henchmen, whom he looks after for self-interest. Yeah. But it's basically like the warlord archetype. The man that can't be tamed by polite society. And that a world, and he states that a world full of heroes would certainly be a disagreeable world to live in. And I disagree with that. If the human race became a race of Homeric heroes, I think they would certainly have a zest and enjoyment of life. He thinks it's likely that the Homeric archetype will see a bit of a return in the future, because one of his most important characteristics is that he is usually by no means monogamous, but very much the reverse, so that his qualities are likely to be reproduced and multiplied many times in the next generation. But these qualities that the Homeric hero possesses do not fit into a society of dense population. They actually prevent its existence. If the human race were to become a race of Homeric heroes, it would prevent the existence of dense population, of dense society. And he believes that densely populated countries are going to dominate the earth by sheer force of numbers. But he doesn't think that the Homeric hero type will go extinct by any means. He thinks that there will still be a place in the world for them in the capacity of leadership. And he says that if this quality could be dissociated from some of the other less desirable characteristics of the hero, there would be a great place for him in society. It is not impossible that such a separation of qualities may come about automatically, because the hero who can adapt himself to the civilized life of dense populations will have a better prospect of survival than the one who can live in a state of semi-barbarism. So he believes in a future with more civilized Homeric heroes who are more free-willed and leaderly, but not barbaric or warlordish, you know. And I have to disagree with him. I think he contradicts himself here when he says that the densely populated countries will dominate the earth by sheer force of numbers when put up against a force of, you know, a wandering race of Homeric hero bandits. Just in one of the previous chapters, and I talked about it, he discusses the fact that throughout human history, it has been small races with small population sizes compared to the rest of the world that go out and dominate. The Athenians, the Spartans, and the Europeans. So I can't say that I completely agree with him, and I think some of his hopes for the future are seeping in here. Some of his personal ideals are seeping in and polluting his objectivity. I think it could go 50-50. I think the battle of the future is going to be quality versus quantity, and I think it could go either way. I don't think the major population centers have a significant advantage over rural humanity because they're all weak. But I don't necessarily think that rural humanity has a significant advantage over the major population centers because there are so few of them and because they're not as technologically advanced. So we'll see what happens going forward. I'm just excited for the fight. The world is a stage, and we must all play our part to make it as interesting as possible. That's my philosophy. But that's as far as I've gotten so far, and I'm glad I got to share it with you all. Hopefully I can get this up tonight, but I've got a lot of other things to do. I gotta go to work pretty soon here, and I've also started a couple college classes, and I've got homework that's due tomorrow. So we'll see what happens. I'm not being too strict on myself considering what a workload I have. I'm not being lazy. I just have my attention being pulled in several different directions at once. So I will be back as soon as I can, but hopefully with more interesting knowledge to share and more thoughts. But I'll see you when I see you.